Tom, you told us that you live in you've also lived in Korea, right?
Hmm.
South Korea, of course, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they don't let gringos into North Korea.
Yeah, they won't like it that much. So I know that you are a Tai Chi instructor, right?
Hmm.
And a student, of course, practitioner. And did you find out about Tai Chi in Korea, or did you? Um, I don't know how did Korea influence you in that way, in that part? And I know you also like very much um, their philosophy, right? Not Korean philosophy specifically, but Western philosophy, Eastern philosophy.
Yeah. Well, Tai Chi actually.
Did
Oh,
you
go
get in
ahead.
touch with them? No, no, sorry. That's it. You can go on.
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's a funny story, but I did. But my interest in Tai Chi didn't come from being in Korea. Um, when I was at Seattle University, the Jesuit universities, they kind of require every area, regardless of what area you study, you have to take courses in multiple areas, and they require you to take theology. But being at our university, we had the option to take like Eastern religions and Buddhism and stuff like that. And where I'd grown up in an evangelical church, and my mom's side of the family was Catholic, I wasn't really that interested in learning about that because I already kind of knew things. I was going to say bastanchi. I had plenty of things about kind of that, those religions. I always was curious about Buddhism because I never knew anything about it. So I ended up taking a course on Buddhism and then a course on Eastern religions that included Taoism. And the second one, we went to a Taoist kind of school temple in Seattle, and this guy showed us some things about Tai Chi. And it was funny because he picked out the biggest guy in our group, and he was like, "Come here and try to push me." And the guy was the Taoist center guy was very tall, but he was very skinny and he looked like a twig. And he picked out this guy who looked like a football player, like just huge. And he was like, "Okay, try to push me." And like the guy couldn't move him, you know. And I kind of just I grew up doing martial arts. Actually, I grew up doing a Korean martial art, Taekwondo. But I got to be really fascinated with Tai Chi after that, also because it had I mean, Taekwondo has a lot of the philosophy, but it's become more of a kind of a sport in the focus that it's been taught in, where Tai Chi is very philosophical. So, and it's more connected to Taoism, which was really kind of the religion / philosophy that most appealed to me out of all the ones I learned about. And then there was the whole health thing. And so when I graduated from college, like I wanted to learn more about these philosophies. And I also knew I needed to start being more active because I was kind of getting older, and I'd like to party a lot when I was in college, and it kind of started to catch up with me. So I was like, all right, well, I should do something that's interesting to me, like that has something to do with kind of the more intellectual stuff. So I went to a school in Seattle first, and I took a Tai Chi and then a Buddhist form of Qigong, which is, like the another type of exercise. Tai Chi is actually both a martial art and Qigong. It's a martial art that incorporates Qigong dynamics and principles. But then when I went to Korea, I spent a year there, and then I was like, I want to get back into this. And I walked past a place that was on the other side of the street of where my apartment was. It had a big banner that said Korea Tai Chi. So with my like very rudimentary Korean, I went up there and I was like, with my book, like, and everything. I think it was like the Lonely Planet guide that had like some phrases and then like some things I'd written down, or that I didn't have a smartphone at the time. I like went in there and tried to like say in Korean, like, I want to learn Tai Chi. And there happened to be a student there that spoke English. So he like translated for me and the teacher. And so I started taking classes with this guy that that had his school across the street from me. And he turned out to be this really interesting guy. He's not much older than I am. But somehow he'd already done so many things in his life. He taught 2 forms of Tai Chi. He had a black belt in Taekwondo. And he had learned like like hardcore taekwondo, not like a lot of times taekwondo in Korea is kind of like little league baseball in the US. It's like what people do when they're kids. And like in the military, supposedly you have to have a black belt after a year, but it's like the express black belt that they do in their military training. And then he was a chiropractor too, a certified chiropractor, a swimming instructor. I think he had a physical education degree too. And he also taught Buddhist meditation, and he had trained with some Taoist mountain in the master in the mountains for several months. Had done this stint where he'd like went and did like became a hermit with this master for several months. So he was just like, and to give you an idea, like he was really good too. Like he was a very good teacher. He taught me without us really being able to speak the same language, but we managed to communicate. To give you an idea about like how good of a teacher he was, Korea is very hierarchical, you know, like they take Confucianism very serious to this day. Especially when it comes to age. But I went hiking with my professor there and some of his students who were quite a bit older than him, like 20, 30 years older than him. And one of his students that was a lot older than him, like said to me while we were hiking, he's like, I think it was the same one that translated the first time I met him, said, I've been spending my whole life looking for a good master. And this guy is it. Like he has good chi is what he told me. You know, he just had a lot of good things to say about him. And I learned a lot from him. And he was somewhat, for some reason, impressed with me. Maybe it was me being a foreigner, but he ended up doing this thing with me where he had me doing like, was doing like 2 or 3 classes a week. And then he was like, why don't you come every day? And I'm not going to charge you more. And then we did this thing, started doing this thing towards the end before I left, where I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and go to the park and train with him. And that was a little intense because he would have me do these like where I have to go around this whole park doing like these exercises where really what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to have a staff and you're supposed to do these like, you know, low stance, these steps. But I didn't have a staff, but I had to do that. And then we'd do these things like where we'd like meditate in front of a tree and stuff like that. And it was really fascinating. And I'm still in touch with him. Actually, I just got back in touch with him via Facebook. Actually, I hadn't talked to him for a while, and then I found him on there, or he found me. And we still don't speak the same language, but between my kind of trying to learn Korean again, and I've started to study it again, and then him using Google Translator and knowing a little bit of English, we keep in touch. But, you know, him and his wife were very unique people because Korea, like I think China is in Japan too, to a certain extent. You know, being a teacher there, I saw this a lot too. You kind of grow up with your life already kind of laid out before you. Like you study hard and then you want to get into one of these few universities. And then once you get into those, once you graduate from one of those universities, like the goal is to work for one of the big corporations like LG or Samsung or something like that. And him and his wife didn't subscribe to that. They did their own thing. So his life was teaching martial arts and meditation and health practices. And he has a gym now. She was a seamstress. Like she had her own what do you call that? Boutique or atelier that was connected to his little school that he had at the time. So they were self-employed people who did what they loved, and that was what their families encouraged them to do too. And they were just very open-minded, warm, welcoming people. When I ended up having some problems out there with my health and also with my living situation, like they did everything they could to help me, and like we're still in touch to this day. And just really, really good people, very unique. But man, the guy was just an amazing martial arts and meditation practitioner, and I learned a lot from him. In fact, the way I found, I'm not going to that school now, but I'm training with some professors that I met there on more of a one-on-one basis. Not now with the coronavirus, but how I found the school that I went to, or knew that I wanted to study at the school that I was studying at here, was that he'd given me some tips on what to look for from a good Tai Chi teacher. And when I went to the school there, I saw that they were doing all those things. So, you know, it helped me continue on with my practice. So, you know, that's something it would be hard to find anywhere else, I think, than Asia. Even in Asia these days, you know, you don't just go and find somebody who's had, you know, instructors from traditional masters who have dedicated their lives to these arts. You know, there's actually more interest in the West these days than there is in the places that they originated. But I somehow happened to be living across the street from one of the people that did have a connection to multiple traditional lineages.
Tom, now the 3-word thing again. 3 words about your experience in Korea, not about Korea, but about your experience in Korea.
Yeah.
How you felt afterwards?
Lots of unforgettable adventures.
Okay, that seems like a trailer of an 80s movie. The Goonies, but lots of. Okay, yeah. but it was great actually. Now you told us about Montana, and then about Seattle, then Montana, then Mexico, Puebla, right?
Yeah.
Korea, and all that brought you to Brazil. And
no, go ahead.
So tell us how you got here, because after all that, you're here.
Well, you know, Brazil has kind of been in the plans for a long time because, like I mentioned earlier, my best friend from high school is from here, and my first international experience was here. It was kind of what actually, well, it was absolutely what sparked my love for travel and fascination with other cultures and languages was coming to Brazil when I was 17. And I just really loved the reception I got here, how open and warm the people were, and the food too was something I love. You know, I used to be a cook too, with all my all the different fields I've worked in, because I love food. And you know, I just had some really good, a really good experience here, and some good friends. I mean, not just my friend Alessandro, but my friend Sabrina too. She doesn't live here anymore, but who's from São Paulo. And then I met Aline, Ryan's wife here. In fact, I was the one that introduced him to her. And you know, we stayed in touch. And so and then like I said, you know, even when I traveled to other places, a lot of times I ended up getting along really well with Brazilians. Even when I was in Korea, I was taking Korean classes at a university there at night. And one of the fellow students that I ended up a lot of times hanging out with after classes was an English professor from Curitiba. So like kind of everywhere I go, I end up connecting to Brazilians. But you know, I left Korea a little bit earlier than I wanted to. I spent 1.5 years there, but I had some health problems that ended up kind of required me to come back to the U.S. And but I still wanted to go live somewhere else again. And kind of my plan was to finally go to Brazil, or go to New Zealand, because I wanted to do go someplace I could do a working holiday. They have these working holiday visas in Commonwealth nations, the former colonies of the UK that are still part of the Commonwealth organization. And I just thought it would be a fun place to go to. I've always wanted to try surfing, and I like hiking and stuff like that. But a week after I got back from Korea to the US, I was living with Ryan, and it was a trailer on an island that's actually in the sound of Seattle. We weren't living in Seattle. We were living in this really beautiful island. And Aline, Ryan's wife, who I'd known since the first time I came here when I was 17, we just kind of gotten back in touch on Facebook a couple months before I left for Korea. And she's also a huge grunge fan, giant Pearl Jam fan. And so, you know, I knew that she always wanted to come to Seattle. So I said, you know, hey, sometime I'm going back, you know, when you have a vacation, you should come out to Seattle sometime and we can hang out. And so that ended up being a week after I came back from Korea. And she was like, "Oh, can I bring a friend of mine?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah, sure, sure." Well, that friend of hers was Erica, who's now my wife. So I met Erica. Nothing really happened between me and Erica that first time, but we stayed in touch and then realized that we liked each other. And then they came back up to see us a few months after that, and we started dating. And we did the long distance thing for about a year. And I came out here once, both to stay with her, and also for my friend Alessandro, my original friend from Brazil, for his wedding. And she came out to Seattle to stay with me a couple times. I'd moved back to Seattle after a while because I was working there and it was easier. And so we just decided, well, I'd always wanted to live in Brazil, and this is where Erica lives. And it was easier for me to come here than for her to immigrate there. And I was already used to living far from my family, where Erica's, very close to her family. So it just made sense, it was what I already wanted to do, and then I really wanted to do after I met Erica. So that's what happened. And then I came here and we got married, and that was, 7 years ago last month.
Nice. When you finally came to Brazil and started living here, what surprised you? What were some of the differences between what you had in your mind about Brazil as a tourist or as a outsider, not someone who lived here? And then once you started living in Brazil and became a resident, a person who is here every day and has to live through the day-to-day experience of São Paulo, Santo André, the culture, what are some things that surprised you?
Yeah. Well, funny enough, after living in Korea, what surprised me is how it didn't really feel that is different as I thought it was going to, because I think maybe the comparison or something, but like seriously, man, like the first year I'd walk down the street and sometimes I'd forget that I was in another country until I'd heard somebody speak Portuguese, like, I don't know, it just in the comparison, I guess, like I didn't have culture shock at all anymore, like coming to Brazil. I mean, I kind of, already had been here a couple times. So like when I would have culture shock, I think was the first time, but even so, like it's different than living in a place. But, it just, after living in Korea, it didn't seem that much different than I thought it was going to be. So yeah, I mean, that was actually kind of a funny thing about it. And how much like pizza and esfihá paulistanos eat too, like that was kind of a surprise. I got really fat really fast, like I wasn't expecting to gain all this weight that I did. I lost it recently after when I had my surgery, but I'd never been so fat in my life than when I moved to Brazil. And it's so funny because people think about that in the US, like, everybody eats fast food and hamburgers and pizza and stuff. Well, Seattle has such a rich culinary variety there that I really didn't eat much fast food when I lived there. And I cook a lot at home. So like I actually ate a lot healthier than when I lived in Seattle than when I moved to Korea. And we were living we were sharing an apartment with Erica's two brothers and her sister. This really nice apartment in a really nice neighborhood of São Paulo called Higienópolis. They'd somehow found this giant but yet cheap apartment in this very wealthy neighborhood. But because we had so many people living in the same apartment and nobody really wanted to do dishes, and at the time, the economy was better than it is now. What we ended up doing a lot of times was just ordering esfihá and pizza, and then us all eating together. And so I just like inflated the first year that I was here. That was something I was not expecting. So that was definitely one big difference. And like I said, like kind of politics and activism was a big part of me. And I was kind of surprised with how conservative actually people are here. I always had this idea where it being like, a Latin open country, that people would be a little bit more, I don't know, politically progressive than São Paulo turned out to be, which is neither here nor there. But that was kind of
just surprising.
Yeah, especially
Yeah.
coming from Seattle, like, like I was saying, like Seattle being the way it is, that was my impression of big cities too, was because after coming from rural Montana, that people were generally more, had more that kind of perspective. And
Mhm.
so that was kind of a surprise to me too. But yeah, at the same time, it wasn't as much of a shock as I thought it would be. I didn't, the language, I'd already studied Portuguese before I came, and my plan with Spanish worked out great, except for I ended up loving Spanish when I was in Mexico, and now I can barely speak it because I get so confused with Portuguese. But it really, really helped with learning Portuguese. And then when I was getting ready to move here for about 6 months, I'd done the Pimsleur program, which I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's really interesting. It has this philosophy about repetitions. It's all audio based. So I didn't study grammar. I haven't studied any Portuguese formally, but it hasn't gotten in the way of being a translator. Actually, I mean, my translation is pretty much exclusively from Portuguese to English. But I was able to teach myself for the most part. I didn't really have that many problems speaking and understanding when I first moved here, except for my mother and father-in-law, just kind of because of the way they are. My mother-in-law speaks very fast, and then my father-in-law speaks very quietly. So it took me about 1.5 years before I could speak to my mother and father-in-law and understand them. But in general, everybody else, I I didn't have that much problems with.
Well, I've got to say that my experience coming is sort of the same, but I did have one big surprise. When I first came here, I had never been out of the United States before, so
Yeah.
I was expecting some kind of culture shock, but I didn't have any. I mean, São Paulo is just like another big city. And so it was like Seattle. I would take public transit to work. And then because my work is an English school, I didn't have to learn Portuguese. So I would just show up to work, and Rodrigo was my boss. And all of my coworkers were English teachers. And they just wanted to speak English with me. And all of the students needed to speak English with me. And so I never spoke Portuguese. I still don't really speak Portuguese. And my life was basically a bubble where I would leave the apartment, go to the metro, take the train, walk to the school, come home, and the whole time I didn't need to interact with anyone except the people that were like, English, let's speak English with you. And the one surprise was that as soon as people knew that I was American, they were like, oh my God, you're amazing. Everything you say is true. It doesn't matter what the topic is at all. I could tell them, oh yeah, actually, Albert Einstein didn't exist. And it's all just a big conspiracy theory. And this whole like E equals MC squared is not true. And gravity is just, it doesn't exist. And they'd be like, well, I don't know, but you're American. I'm going to look into this.
Is that true, Rodrigo?
Yeah. Well, yes.
It's like having a superpower. And it was it was very weird at first. That was the biggest cultural shock, is that I had this superpower of Americanness. And then I could just tell people things, and they'd be like,
Here
yeah.
we have an expression, complexo de vira-lata, underdog complex or underdog disorder, something like that. Or no, imposter syndrome, maybe.
I think that'd be the best translation. The literal translation
so.
would be like would be a mutt syndrome or something like that.
Mutt,
But I think imposter syndrome is the actual. It's what it's called in the
Well, I mean, that would be a better translation.
Yeah.
So here in Brazil, we do that, not only to American people, but we tend to do that a lot, even to other Brazilian people, just really, I'm humble, and you know better than I do, and that, well, what you've seen lately in media and our and politics and everything, that's not really the bulk of Brazilian people. You know,
Yeah.
we've seen a lot of arrogant people, a lot of people with erratic behavior, just crazy people, and that's not really what Brazilian people are like. People, I mean, raça, as you said, you know, our
Yeah.
people, we're not like that. Not at all. Like 85% of people are not like that at all. So
Oh
Ryan,
yeah,
do you
I
want
mean,
to?
the thing that
And
brought me to Brazil was the people. I love the people. I feel like the whole Vira-Lata complex is really a kind of crazy because for me, like Brazilians are some of the best people in the world. And it's funny because growing up in the U.S., everybody was convinced that the U.S. is the greatest country in the world. And then being in Brazil, everybody's convinced that Brazil is the worst country in the world. And neither is true, you know, I mean, but it's kind of funny. I feel like it's almost like in that respect, it's almost like they're like the two sides of the same coin, you know? And what were you going to say, Ryan? I'm sorry.
oh, I was just going to ask you another question, but that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Is that the United States and Brazil are actually very similar, like eerily, like it freaks me out sometimes how similar the two countries are, but they're like looking at a Black Mirror kind of similar. Like you said, the United States thinks it's the best and Brazil thinks it's the worst. Well, it's a
Yeah.
very similar idea. They're just the opposite sides of it. And I see this a lot in Brazil. Is that something weird about the United States? Well, Brazil does the same thing, but like a little bit different.
Yeah.
It's
Sometimes
like
it's even
it's
like
like
a hold my beer situation. But yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, the U.S. does that. Well, then
We
we
can
got
do
to
it
do
too,
that.
but in a
Yeah.
more crazy way.
Yeah. For better or for worse.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have one more question for you before we wrap up,
I was just
and
before I
it's
was going to comment about the
yeah,
bubble that you said too. That's interesting because I feel like I lived in a bubble too. You know, being kind of expats, and I worked at home from the time that I moved here, being a translator, and having my my living with my sister and her I mean not my sister, with my wife and her sister and brother, and her being with her family, and then having friends here. I really didn't feel like I broke out of that. And then going to Tai Chi helped a little bit when I started studying Tai Chi, but I didn't really feel like I kind of broke out of that bubble until this last year when I started working with the São Paulo Climate Coalition and started going to a lot of different parts of town and meeting different types of people. But it was kind of like a very bubble experience. Now we're back in the bubble with the whole quarantine thing. But yeah, it's interesting that you said that because it was very much of a bubble at the same time. But I always tried, like I said, when I was in Korea and Mexico, like to try to get to know local people. Where here, I was with a family that I married into, but somehow I still ended up in a bubble where I didn't really interact with a lot of people outside of my wife's family and close friends until recently.
mhm.
I'm not sure why that is. Maybe part of it has to do with the professional side, just always working at home. But that was very similar to my experience too.
Yeah. So my last question is: if you take all of your previous experiences, living outside of the country, being an expat, they were all like short-term experiences that had a set end date. And so you knew that it was going to end and you were able to plan your life around, in 6 months this will be over, or the Korean situation, you knew eventually I was going to go back home. Maybe you didn't have a date, but you knew that at some point you were going to go back. But now that you live in Brazil, it's almost a permanent situation. I mean, maybe someday you might go back to the United States or not, but living here is kind of now your permanent life. And how did your previous experiences, which were this short-term situation, prepare you for your current life as a permanent expat?
Well, and I think just the way you have to adapt to different situations and different cultures and different people. Um, I think with every experience, I learned a little bit more of how to do that. So like the transition was easier. Like I said, it was surprisingly there wasn't really much of a shock moving here. I think the shocks were more about being in the huge city, but even then, I mean, I lived in a suburb of Seoul when I was in Korea. Um, so I think it helped me with that kind of learning. One of the things being in Korea, I think I learned how to be more bold and kind of, even though I can be a pretty outgoing person, I can also be kind of shy. And like that just, we don't speak the language and you have to go buy food and stuff, that doesn't work. So it was more easy for me then to come here and all of a sudden live with this other family, that like I was, of course, I'd already spent a lot of time with Erica, but I didn't know her family. And it wasn't that bad because I ended up getting along really well with everybody, her parents, brothers, sister, everyone. But, just kind of having to adapt to other people's ways. And I mean, even though, like you said, it wasn't that different from the US, still, like, there's quite a few things that you just have to, and be in a different situation, a different work situation, a different city, different activities. I think being more adaptable, being more bold, and learning those things, adaptability, and also getting over the social anxiety, shyness that I had before. That helped a lot in making São Paulo and in the São Paulo area my home. Um, so yeah, I think it was much easier for me than it would have been otherwise, having had those experiences beforehand. And also just I think I'm able to kind of, I've always been pretty good at this, but I think even better now, transitioning between different social groups, hanging out with people of different backgrounds, different social classes and stuff like that, different interests. I think it's generally a little bit easier for me because I kind of know when to shut up and listen, and like when to talk when I'm with a new group of people. And that was something that I think I learned kind of the hard way in Mexico, because I did a little bit of a snot-nosed, arrogant kid when I went there, and then got to be pretty humbled after 6 months there. And then in Korea, where you had to really just kind of feel your way through things, because at the same time that it was one of the Asian countries that's most influenced by the West, it's also just has such a totally different background, very different cultural perspective. And that was what I loved about it, actually, because like I said, it was always an adventure, but you really have to learn to kind of, feel your way through things, understand that people do things differently, and that, kind of figure out how you fit in with that. And so I think that helped me moving to another city, another place, integrating into a new family, new career too, because I had done a lot of different things before I became a translator, and I actually just started translating when I came here. And I ended up landing a really good job that helped me learn a lot and transition into that. So a lot of it I think had to do with luck too. But yeah, when it comes down to it, I think learning that kind of adaptability, how and when to be kind of outgoing and bold with people, and and then also kind of being able to also, on the other hand, be quiet and kind of feel your way through things, and know how to integrate. I think those are things I learned from the previous experiences.
Cool. Well, I think that's it, unless, Rodrigo, do you have anything else you want to ask? Anything else for today?
No. I have other ideas that I'd like to talk to Tom, but that it will take forever because they're very complex. It involves Taoism and spirituality and homeschooling, lots of things. Maybe we can have another meeting.
We'll have to have another episode with Tom.
Sure.
So thanks, Tom, for coming on. It's really great.
My pleasure.
And you covered a lot of stuff. So just thank you a lot.
Yeah.
And everybody that's watching, don't forget that Tom is a translator. He just mentioned it, but remember that he's a really great translator. So if you have anything that you need translated, whether it's a document or some presentation or even a complete book, look for his information in the description, which is right below here in the video, and send him an email. Contact him.
My website's down at the moment, but it should be right back up pretty soon. So if you guys try to look for my website right away, it may not be there, but it'll be back soon. But I'll give my email too, and you know, other contact information. So, which is better anyways. I mean, it's just to get contact with me directly.
Cool.
Maybe if you have a TikTok or a Snapchat account, maybe people can check you out there.
Oh yeah. I've got there's an animation made on Snapchat right now circulating of me being an Easter bunny. That's apparently is quite hilarious. So maybe I should put that as my professional information.
There you go.
Okay.
Perfect. But for everybody, thank you for watching, and check out all of our other videos. Last week we had a really great one about the present continuous, and next week I think we'll be doing one about adjectives. And check us out, of course, next week for whoever our next guest is. And until then, see you guys and have a great week.